All right, Chapter 10, Democracy in America. Foner steals that title, of course, from Alexis de Tocqueville, who comes to America during this time, in the 1830s, and is one of the most important figures, one of the most important outside observers to comment on this idea of democracy. And so I'm going to just talk about really three main ideas that Foner is emphasizing in this chapter that I want you to look out for, and as you're rereading the chapter, to really think about. The first is this, that this is the period in which democracy becomes a positive word in American life, in American culture, where democracy becomes a central part of our national identity. Of course, that's what we've all grown up with, and that's what we understand now, so it seems natural to assume that it was always there. But as we've talked about in class, for the founding generation, democracy was a very dangerous thing, right? It was associated with anarchy and the rule of the mob, and so the founders built into the Constitution in particular ways to insulate the government from democracy, from the people. And it's not until this period, what some folks call the Age of Jackson, that you see a transformation in this understanding of democracy. And Jackson is both he's both a symbol of this change, and he's a driver of this change. And so this first part of the textbook, Foner's really trying to emphasize how much the culture has changed and why, right? That democracy, the idea that poor people, really is what it comes down to. The idea that poor people should be able to participate, that there should not be property exclusions for voting, starts to build during the revolution, right? We've talked about how revolutionary ideas can take on lives of their own, right? And that if the founding generation may have been very elite, almost even aristocratic, and their conception of who should hold power might have been one thing, but once those ideas of liberty and freedom and democracy start percolating through the culture, other people start to say, well, why not us? Why should there be property qualifications for voting? I mean, this was something that was taken for granted for the founding generation and for decades before that. But it becomes called into question, and he talks about how state by state property exclusions are dropped from the constitutions. And then he talks about Rhode Island, the one holdout. And this is where Foner is different from maybe other textbooks that you might have read, and other textbooks that are out there, because of his focus on freedom and because of his fascination with democracy and how our conception of freedom has changed over time. For the founding generation, freedom didn't include poor people voting, right? That just wasn't what they understood as political freedom. But by the early decades of the 19th century, more and more people are questioning that. They're saying, well, we should have freedom. Why not? Why should there be property qualifications? Once you start asking those questions, it becomes harder and harder to defend the property exclusions, right? The property requirements. So he talks about how this happens and what effect that it has on the nation, right? As more and more people are participating, and the voting participation rates just start to rise and hit levels during the 19th century that we haven't seen since then. But there's a limit, right? And he talks on page 376. 377, 378, about the limits on democracy, right? And he has a really important line on page 376, right in the middle, where he says that as democracy triumphed, as this idea that the people should rule and that there shouldn't be property qualifications, the definition of what the people were, who the people were, really starts to become more narrow. Right? As democracy triumphed, the intellectual grounds for exclusion shifted from economic dependency to natural incapacity, right? So before, people said, well, you can't be free if you're not economically independent. That was the whole point of the property qualification, right? If you are renting, if you owe your livelihood and subsistence to someone else, then you are not truly free. the democratic impulses of the early 19th century really destroy the basis of that argument, right? Because people say no, that it's freedom of the self, right? You have control of yourself, even if you're a renter, even if you don't own property, yet you will sometime, right? That's not what should qualify people to vote. But once you eliminate that, then people say, well, what about other people? What about women? What about black people? What about Indians? What about these other folks who have traditionally been excluded, in large part because they've been economically dependent? And so what you start to get, and this, as he says on page 377, this is a shift, right? This is something of a departure. It's not that there wasn't racism, of course, before the age of Jackson. Of course there was. But there was a sense that if a free black person, for example, owned his own business, owned his own property, why should that person be excluded? He's proven himself worthy of being part of the political process. Well, what happens in the early decades of the 19th century is you see this shift toward having natural explanations that black people just are naturally inferior and therefore cannot be allowed to vote. Even if they somehow manage to accumulate property, they should still be excluded. Women as well, Indians as well, and of course black slaves. They're completely shut out of the political process. And so, and although he does point out Maine was the only exception to the rule that limited the right to vote to white males. But what you see more and more states excluding even free blacks from the political process, North and South. And so on page 278, this last section is really important, where he talks about race replacing class as the boundary between those American men who were entitled to enjoy political freedom and those who were not. So that last sentence, I can't emphasize this enough, because this is going to become the battle that then goes on long after the Civil War, long after slavery is abolished. Then you get 100 years of segregation and political exclusion. And the reason comes down to this: in a country where the right to vote had become central to the meaning of freedom. Right. This is the whole point of democracy. Being able to vote is central to our understanding of freedom. It's difficult to overstate the importance of the fact that white male immigrants could vote in some states almost the moment they landed in America, while nearly all free blacks, and of course slaves, whose ancestors had lived in the country for centuries, could not vote at all. Right? And this becomes the nub. Whenever people say, "Oh, it's not race, it's class," that's the dividing line in America. You can go back and say, well, yes, class is important, and it plays an important role at various times, sometimes more, sometimes less during American history. But race is even more fundamental, because how is it that an Irish immigrant can come off the boat and soon be voting, whereas that black man whose ancestors came in the 1600s, who worked his way to freedom, who has his own blacksmith shop, who has proven himself in all other ways to be a capable and productive citizen, how come that man can't vote? Right? So race trumps class. Race is the ultimate dividing line in the American political system. So that's one part of that point that I really want you to focus on. The next part is to talk about how what the market revolution does, and westward expansion does, is it produces these new tensions in American life. And he goes through that in this next section, Nationalism and Its Discontents, right? That this American system that many of the presidents, including James Madison, really promote, this idea that the government's going to finance, really help spur the market revolution on and spur westward expansion on. It produces these new tensions. One is the cycle of boom and bust, which is new. These busts, like they call them panics, which I think is a great word, by the way. And it reveals the sense of anxiety that a lot of people felt about the market revolution. That this idea of panic, that suddenly all the money that you thought you had is gone, or loses all its value all at once. What kind of emotion does that inspire people? It inspires a sense of panic, right? People are panicking about the economic system. And this is going to produce a lot of anxiety that's going to be manifested in the political system. And this is part of where we get Andrew Jackson from. westward expansion is also going to raise the question of slavery. Right? Well, what are you going to do about slavery? Does slavery expand as the nation expands? Does that mean that slaveholders are going to have more and more slaves and become more and more powerful within Congress? So what happens, even by 1820, when you get the Missouri Compromise that he discusses in here, is that you see more and more Northerners, people who aren't necessarily unracist or anything, or anti-slavery because of moral concerns, but they start to say, well, wait a minute, this is going to be a problem for us, and we don't want to see Southerners expanding their power. But the main focus of this chapter, of course, is Jackson. And Jackson is a seminal figure, and I urge you to think about him critically and thoughtfully to understand why he's so important. I mean, people forget Martin Van Buren, and John Quincy Adams was a tremendous figure in a lot of ways, but he did not capture the American imagination the way Jackson did. And so, on page 391, he starts this section on the age of Jackson, and he talks about it. He's kind of like Thomas Jefferson in a way, because he's a man of paradoxes and contradictions. He's a man who embodies a lot of what Americans love about themselves and their country, and what a lot of Americans are really frustrated with about themselves or their country, right? I mean, he's the first man of the people. I mean, contrast him with John Quincy Adams in terms of his education, his background, his experience in life, his demeanor. I mean, Jackson is rough. The slogan he has, vote for Jackson who can fight as opposed to Adams who can write. This idea of being, the tough Western frontiersman. I mean, this guy he was a badass. I mean, they called him Old Hickory for a reason, because he was so tough. I mean, he led his men into battle. He didn't just sit back and have them fight. I mean, he led charges, bayonet charges. He fought duels, dozens and dozens of duels. He had one duel against a famous duelist who killed 20-something men, and his plan was to just let the guy shoot first. He did. Jackson gets shot in the chest, and then he points his gun, shoots, and kills the guy. That bullet stayed in his chest the rest of his life, through all his military career and his presidency. I mean, this was a tough man. A guy tried to assassinate him when he was 67. Jackson knocks the gun out of his hand, starts beating him with his cane. Americans love that, right? We love the rugged individualist, and that he's the first one of this type. He's the first man of the people, and he brings a very different vision in, and so. He is the founder of the modern Democratic Party. I mean, when Bill Clinton took office, the first thing he did was put a statue of Andrew Jackson, a little bust in his office, because he's sort of the precursor of the modern Democratic Party. This idea of being on the side of the people versus the side of centralized power, the banks, and all these nefarious influences. But at the same time, he's also he orchestrates Indian removal, right? He does not think Indians have any place in American society. He is profoundly anti-black. He doesn't think black people have a place in the political process. He thinks if there are any free black people, they need to go, be colonized elsewhere. He is in a lot of ways a very vulgar kind of person, crass. People worry that he was bringing down the image of the presidency because he was letting the rabble into the White House. And so what I want you to write for your extra credit question is, I want you to read the section and think about Jackson in a critical way, and explain why Jackson was and is considered both a hero and a villain in American history. And then I want you to tell me what you think of him. Do you think he's heroic? Do you think he's a villain? A bit of both? How do you think we should celebrate him? So that's your extra credit question. It's just to explain why Jackson was and is considered a hero and a villain in American history, and then tell me your opinion of him. So read the chapter carefully, and then we'll talk more about Jackson in class.